Hi everyone, I'm Allie with PotomacBeads. Join me in creating this carousel bracelet, sure to be a hit with circular brick stitch and some glass rings. If you need any of the materials, you can shop with us online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. So to begin the carousel bracelet, it's just circular brick stitch. I've done a video before using a bead in the middle, and I thought it would be fun to use the donut in the middle to change it up a little bit, and it's in that kind of fun carousel horse colors. So I have a 9mm Czech ring, and this is a glass ring. You can use a variety of things. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna do 3 rows of Delicas in that circular brick stitch, and then sew them together. You can decorate the outer edge with a little 15. I'll go over how to do that, but we're gonna keep it really, really simple. I have some .006 wildfire beading thread on a size 10 needle, and I have about 4 feet of thread. I'm gonna take the thread through the ring and simply tie a knot with my thread. Tie once and twice. You only need to leave enough thread here to be able to hold on to, basically, to tie a knot at the very end. From here, this thread in the knot, I push to the outer side of the ring. That way, you really don't see the knot at all. You don't want it laying in the interior because you will see a little bit of it. I'm using black thread because I'm using a black ring. If you want to use a different colored ring, there's lots of options in the Miyuki thread, or you can stick to a white or a silver in some of the different brands. When you're first starting the circular brick stitch, you're going to start with 2 beads on your thread. Let them drop down to the ring. You're going to sew through the ring from the back to the front. And I have my hands here kind of gripping so that way the beads do not fall into the ring. You're going to sew back up through the second bead. Circular brick stitch is always going to start with 2 beads on when we first go into the new row. After that, we then put on 1 bead at a time. 1 bead goes down. I sew through the ring from the back to the front. Kind of hold that bead so that way it doesn't actually fall into the ring, and then sew back through the bead. What this is allowing is these beads to sit upright so that their holes are facing to the exterior of the ring rather than kind of laying around the bead. Again, continue on putting 1 bead on, letting it drop down next to the ring, sew through the back of the ring, and bring your needle towards the front. Once you bring your needle to the front of the ring then, what I want you to do is, again, sew back through that bead here. Now you'll notice I have a little bit of a gap. You wanna make sure that you can kind of see an equal distance between your thread and the bead, that they're all gonna sit a little bit kind of equal distance apart. You don't want to see a huge gapping amount of thread between the bead, and you don't want the bead to sit on top of one another. The perfect size for this is going to be 18 seed beads around this 9mm ring. So I'm going to continue going on here, putting the Delica beads onto this. Now keep in mind, again, you can use any bead to do this. You can use 8 seed beads, you can use 11 seed beads, you can even use 15 seed beads. You do not have to use just Delicas. The reason I'm using the Delicas is because I'm going to be using a variety of kind of that carousel color, and I like how nicely they sit right around one another. Remember also with this circular brick stitch, it's fun to use different sizes in your project. So you can go from a Delica to an 11 or an 8. And the only thing that changes is the amount of beads that go on each row. Naturally, this circular brick stitch is going to get bigger, and you're going to add more beads if you're using the same size bead as you go from a single time around to your second or third time around. So here I have in 7 beads so far, and I'm going to continue going around the circle till I get to that 18 beads. Once there, I'll show you how we're going to catch on to that first bead that we did not sew back through, and then also how we step up to go into our next ring around the second row. So here I am at the end of this first row. Now you could see it almost looks like I can fit another bead there, but when I pull it and close it tightly, there's no space in there for another bead. So you want to make sure that your brick stitch here, that your beads are not overlapping. You don't want them to kind of buckle and kind of potato chip around each other. What you're going to do is you end your last bead, that 18th bead. I want you to come down through bead number 1, and that's going to create that bridge of thread there like we have with the rest of the pieces, and connect the 2 together. There you have it, creating that seamless row. From here, you're going to sew up through the back of the project, and then you're going back then into that first bead that you put on. So basically, instead of putting another bead on, you're going right through the first. There will be 2 pieces of thread then, it's hard to see the black on the black. There will be 2 pieces of thread that look like they're going through that first bead. That's gonna get us through that first row of our brick stitch. What you wanna make sure is that you don't have a lot of extra thread showing along the sides, creating a really gappy effect. And you also wanna make sure, again, that your beads aren't sitting over top of one another. It's better to have a little bit of space than no space at all. This color too, in case you're wondering, was the Opaque Nile Blue Delica in the 11-0. From here, I'm gonna go in and add a galvanized dark steel blue. And it's nice and important too, if you are doing this, it's nice to kind of clean up the color that you are working on while you work on them and pull them out in just little sections. I always use the top of the bead container to work as my scoop, or we sell scoopies, and then you can get more out when you need them to keep a nice kind of clean working surface. My third row then, I'm gonna do the opaque glazed rainbow, pulling in kind of all of these little carousel colors. Just like we did on the previous row, when we were going in, we're gonna put on 2 beads first to start out our brick stitch. You're gonna look over past one of these bridge threads there to the second bridge thread. The bridge thread is gonna be the thread that gaps over top of the bead. So if my 2 beads are here, that bridge thread is gapping over the top and connecting those 2 beads together. The second bridge thread, so you're gonna skip over the first because we're adding 2 beads at a time, and we're gonna go to the second bridge thread. Instead of going through the ring now, we're gonna go through the back of the bridge thread, right there, and to the front. When you pull that nice and tight, the beads kind of already wanna sit the way that they're supposed to. And I'm gonna take the thread and needle and sew back up through that bead number 2. You can see there it creates that little loop. And from that little loop, you're gonna pull and finish it up. Do not pull too tight because you want to be able to have that first bead sit so that it is top to bottom. Adding your second bead, you're gonna go over to the next bridge thread rather, right along the line. So under that, from the back to the front, and then sew back through that bead that you just added, going towards the top. You'll see how these lay then right on top of one another in almost that brick wall section. Because we are expanding for this row, you are going to need to find a space to add another bead to it. So your first row with a 9mm exterior bead is going to be 18 beads. Your second row, you're gonna add 1 to 2 beads in. How you're going to do that is that when you get to a point that you have a little bit of a gap, here I am, I'm on my 5th bead. I'm gonna take that 5th bead, go through that single loop there, go back up through, and whether or not you sew away from you or towards you to make it easier, that's up to you. And now I have a little bit of extra space. So I'm gonna go into that same bridge thread that my thread just went through. So underneath that same bridge thread, so I'm not jumping over to the next one, 2 beads are gonna share 1 bridge thread and then go back up through. There I'm at the spot now where I have those 2 in there. So I just added a bead into the rotation to make it so my beads are finishing my whole way around. If you do want to stick with the number 18, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with more space between your thread and you're going to see a little bit more of those bridges of thread, which is absolutely fine as well. But for this design, I am going to go in and make sure to add 1 to 2 extra beads. Feel it out and see especially what size you're using. Again, you don't want them sitting too close to one another and you don't want them sitting too far apart. So just kind of feel out as you're working with it. And the more you do it, the better idea you will get as far as when you need to add 2 beads to 1 bridge thread or whether or not you're skipping to a bigger bead and you actually need to skip over. So if I was going from a Delica, say, to an 8/0 seed bead, I actually wouldn't be going through every seed bead or every bridge thread and tucking underneath the thread and then sewing back through the bead. I might skip every third or so as I work. So you can see here you're going to continue on adding your next row of beads into that bead thread, and I'll end up with an extra 2 beads on this row, so a total of 20 beads in row number 2. So to re-show how we do that connection again, here I am with my last bead on. I'm going back to bead number 1 and I'm sewing down bead number 1. This is why you didn't want to pull too tight, because you want it to be able to stand on its end. Again, you're going to sew underneath that same bridge thread and then go back through bead number 1. Pull a little tight so you make sure you don't have any thread gap. That's kind of the trick of brick stitch, is you want to have a consistent gapping between your actual beads and the thread. So here you can see I see a little bit more thread than I did on row number 1. Again, if you want to, you can make them really, really tight, and you can add them with different beads, different sizes. That's kind of up to you. So on to row 3 here. To do row 3, we're going to go in and add 2 beads again, just like we have been doing. Skip over to the first and go to the second bridge thread. Once you go through the second bridge thread, sew under it, bring it to the front, and sew up through bead number 2. Again, do not pull too tightly, because you want bead number 1 to be able to stand on its own, right there. From here, you're going to add another bead, and I'm already going to go through and share that same bridge thread. So as you go further out, you're going to need to add more beads into the row. I have 2 beads that I've gone through there, or 2 bridge threads. I've skipped over 1, gone through 2, and now as I add bead number 4, I'm going through bridge thread number 3. So that third gap of thread from one to the other. Go ahead and continue around the circle, adding in your beads till you're going to end up with about 25 or so of your Delicas to go around that outer edge. So I ended up with 25 on this exterior row, and you can see a little bit more of that gap, and I could have closed that up if I wanted to, but again, I want to be able to see a little bit of the seed beads and not just have it be so tight next to one another. Coming down back to the start, going back down through bead number 1, sewing kind of underneath the bridge thread right below bead number 1, back up through bead number 1, and giving a tight pull to close up that gap. Now from here, for your first one, all you're going to do is sew back down along the angle next to it, right where your thread's coming out, sew down through those 3 beads and tie off the starter thread, like I did here with one of these. From here, you're going to attach it to your next ring if you're building a bracelet or a necklace. So a simple way to attach is going to be to attach 2 seed beads together. So again, if it's your first one, go ahead and tie off and then start your next one in the same fashion to continue on. What I'm going to do is go straight across to the 2 beads that look kind of most centered on the design there. Probably it's a battle between those 2 right there and these 2 right here. So I think I'll go to those 2 sitting right flush next to one another. My thread is currently coming out, my starter bead. I'm going to go down through the bead on the other circular brick stitch piece. Go up through the bead that sits next to it on that same first piece, and we're literally just quick stitching it together. Go to the bead that sits next to the one the thread was coming out of, and you're going to sew into that one as well. Pull them tight together, and they are linked. Now I'm going to go down and reinforce that one more time, going back through bead number 1, over to the bead on the 3rd brick stitch section that I have here, through the bead next to it, through the bead here. And again, you can connect these in so many different ways, or you can make them singular. They look really cool when they're done in an actual bib style and you have kind of that triangle down. And now all I'm going to do is sew down again, just like I did if I was just starting out, like I said. Go right down through those next 2 beads below, towards the middle, and tie off these 2 thread ends. After I tie off the 2 thread ends, I have enough thread on my needle to do one more of my brick stitch and add it into the design. The trick and the tool to getting this thread nice and flush against the bead after doing those 2 knots is to grab a thread zap or a thread burner. Try to make all your thread ends to the same side if possible, and burn down the thread ends. If you want to, you can actually take where your needle and thread is still connected and sew that somewhere back so you don't have as big of thread and two threads coming out the same spot. After I burn down these threads and kind of massage them into the bead, I'm ready to go to build on my fifth component and keep expanding this carousel bracelet. So once you're done with the bracelet and you have the number of rings you have, you'll see here that I ended up with 6 rings of my Czech glass, and then I decided to do 2 smaller rings on the end. So when I put it on, I have kind of that downgrading from the large to the small, varying the colors that I used with those 6 different Delica colors. Here at the end, when I just added the last clasp here, I already had the thread attached, so it was easy to add the wire guard and then just that, that regular push clasp there. On this other side here, it was basically my starting side. So I actually don't have any thread to attach to. So what I'm going to do is add a new piece of thread. And to add the new piece of thread, what I want you to do is, number one, kind of separate that clasp, grab your thread and needle, and what you're going to do is basically start at the bottom. So go through one of that base threads, and you want to go directly across from the clasp, or from the other loops basically, because you want it to sit directly across as much as possible. I'm going to go on a diagonal then up through one of those from the clasp side, or from the ring side rather, and then through the exterior loop. From here, right across will be about these 2 blue beads, or these 2 blue beads will probably do. I'm going to add my wire guard. And you can see I just have that thread sitting out and hanging there. Go up through your wire guard. Add the clasp onto the wire guard. Go down through the wire guard on the other side, making sure the clasp stays on. And then jump over just like we would be adding on our next loop and add your clasp instead. Give it a nice tight pull, and now we're going to reinforce that. Again, just like we did when we were adding extra rings, going back through that last bead, up through the wire guard and the clasp. You can also use a button and a loop. Those are really kind of fun. These are great bracelets to do a magnetic clasp on because it's actually really quite lightweight. Just pull that thread end down there, go through the clasp, back through the wire guard, and then since this is the second time, I'm going to sew back in towards the center of the project. And I did make sure that as I was doing this, all of my brick stitch rings have their thread ending towards one side. So all of my knots are to one side of my project. So I'm going to make sure I'm on that side. Sewing down through the first 2 rows, because remember the last 2 I just did as 2 rows of my brick stitch rather than 3. Tie off those 2 ends together and finish off your lovely design. Now you can keep going and go bigger, again go bolder, change up designs, change up colors, even change up the colors that you use in the actual disc. I've seen some really fun ones where you can change into kind of ombre colors and go lighter on one side of the disc and then almost do a color wheel. So have fun with the design. Thanks so much for joining me in making this fun carnival bracelet. Remember, there are so many options to use different size seed beads, different size rings, or even glass beads in the middle. There's also so many options when it comes to connection points and different ways to put the pieces together. If you wouldn't mind, comment below and say the best way that you've put brick stitch together, as well as what design elements you've changed or created in this really, really cool stitch. Remember, if you need any of the materials, you can shop with us online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. You can also like and subscribe to this YouTube channel, and you'll get regular updates from us when we go live, have new videos, new tutorials, and new things to bring you in the beading world. Thanks so much for watching, everyone.